Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Roman-style pizza. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make my favorite non-thin crust pizza, which I can confirm is absolutely amazing, although I can't confirm it's absolutely authentic. But I'm pretty sure it's close, and I'm very sure you're going to love it. And to get started, we'll begin our pizza dough like we do almost all of them, by combining flour, yeast, and water, which we will then stir together with a wooden spoon. Oh, and because we're going to do such a long, slow ferment, this time we don't need to start the yeast in the water first. Okay, we can just mix everything together at once. And what we'll do is stir that until almost all the flour is incorporated, and we form sort of a shaggy dough. At which point we'll stop and add the last two ingredients, which is some salt, as well as a generous splash of olive oil. And then we'll continue stirring for at least 2 or 3 more minutes, or until we've formed a very smooth, extremely soft and wet and sticky dough. Okay, one of the secrets to Roman-style pizza is a high hydration dough, which simply means we're using a lot of water, as in like 80% compared to the weight of the flour. And that's it. Once we feel like we've stirred that long enough, we will clean off our spoon with a spatula and scrape down the sides of the bowl. And then what we'll do is cover this and set our timer for 15 minutes, at which point we'll perform the first of 3 foldings, which, yes, is going to be very similar to the technique we use for sourdough. And of course, we're going to want to wet our fingers first to prevent the dough from sticking too much. And what we'll do is grab the dough at the edge of the bowl and sort of pull it and stretch it over the top, and then we will rotate the bowl a few inches and do the exact same thing. And we'll repeat that about 10 or 12 times. And if possible, after the last fold, if we can sort of gather that dough together and fold it over, and end up with some sort of smooth skin over the top, that's considered an advantage. But don't stress if you can't do that, especially on this first fold, since it does take a little bit of time for that elastic texture to develop. And then what we'll do is cover that back up and set our timer for another 15 minutes. And like I said, we're going to do that 3 times total, which I'm not going to show you. I'm just going to skip to me finishing the last fold. And by the time you finish this process, you're really going to notice the change texturally in the dough. Okay, it's going to be much smoother, much more elastic, and easier to work with. And then what we'll do once our 3 folds have been completed is transfer this into some kind of airtight container that we've greased with a little bit of olive oil. And once we transfer our dough in, we'll drizzle a few drops of oil on the top and then give it a quick rub down. After which we're going to transfer this into the fridge and we're going to let it ferment for 24 hours or until it's about doubled in size. And a day later, this is what mine looked like. Oh, and one tip I can give you, if you use a smaller container, it's a little easier to see if your dough has doubled. Although having said that, after 24 hours, you should be in good shape. And I could tell my dough is ready for the next step, which is to transfer it onto the work surface. And then what we'll do, using some damp hands, is sort of press and stretch that dough out into something hopefully resembling a square. Since before we shape this back into a ball, we want to do some kind of fold, which I find myself doing differently every time for some reason. Okay, this time I folded it in half, and then back over in half the other way, before I finish with a trifold, which I think gave me 12 layers, but don't quote me on it. And then once that's been completed, we will dampen our hands again, and we'll use this kind of circular motion to shape that back into a ball of dough, ideally with some kind of relatively smooth skin over the top. And if you want, feel free to use a bench scraper to help you with this step, since we're going to use that to pick up our dough anyway. Speaking of which, we could, if we want, just transfer this back into the original container, and that would work fine. But I'm actually going to take my own advice and transfer this into an olive oil greased baking dish, just so it's a little bit easier to see what's happening to the dough. And once we have that transferred in, we will again brush a little bit of olive oil over the top, just so the surface doesn't dry out. Although with a dough this wet, that's probably not going to happen. But anyway, after that, we're going to cover this back up, and we're going to pop it back in the fridge for another 24 hours, or until, yes, you guessed it, it's just about doubled in size. And I know you wanted pizza like 2 days ago, but trust me, it's going to be so worth it. And at this point, we can start shaping our pizza if we want. But after coming out of the fridge, I do like to leave this covered and let it sit on the counter for about an hour, just to warm up a little bit. So that's what I did, at which point my dough looked like this. And then to make the actual pizza, we will transfer our dough onto a well olive oiled baking sheet. And by the way, that dough's just supposed to flop out perfectly and not stick to the dish like mine did. But anyway, it's fine. We're just making pizza, so everybody relax. And then to form this, we will take our fingertips, which are now coated in a little bit of olive oil, and we will give this the old poka, which is not only going to degas the dough, meaning knock out some of the air, but we're also at the same time stretching the dough out to mostly but not quite fill the pan. And generally the Roman-style pizzas have kind of a rectangular shape with sort of rounded corners. So that's what I usually go with. But if you want a nice square pizza that's a little thinner, by all means try to press that into the corners. And that's it. Once we're happy with our size and our shape, we will drizzle and brush a little more olive oil over the top before we do the first of 2 different bakings. And this is another secret to the Roman-style pizza. We have to pre-bake the crust before we top it. Right, for the first one, we're going to transfer this into the center of a 500-degree oven for about 15 minutes, or until our crust is golden brown and hopefully looks like this. And then after letting this rest for about a minute on the pan, we'll transfer it onto a cooling rack, where I like to let it cool all the way down to room temp before we top it, and then pop it in for the final baking. And while we wait for that to cool, we'll have plenty of time to get our sauce together and whatever toppings we're going to use. And no matter what those are, once we're ready to move into final production, we will transfer our crust onto a lightly olive-oiled baking sheet, and we will apply our favorite pizza sauce, which may or may not be one of the pizza sauces we've posted, but I kind of hope it is. And after I did have that sauced almost all the way to the edge, I went ahead and applied my grated cheese, which this time was half mozzarella and half Monterey Jack, which, as you might know, is my favorite blend to top a pizza with. And then as far as the other toppings, I went with some crumbled Italian sausage, as well as some sweet pepper and onion. And yes, that was all cooked ahead of time, which I think makes for a much better pizza topping. Okay, you can get away with putting raw sausage on the pizza, but sometimes that just makes it too greasy. And I am definitely not a fan of putting raw vegetables on a pizza, since they sometimes don't cook enough. And I do not want raw crunchy vegetables on a pizza. Right, that stuff's for salad. But anyway, you go ahead and top that any which way you want. I mean, you are, after all, the Gabriel Bonci of what this Roman-style pizza should be. But no matter what we use, I think we want to finish up with some freshly grated Parmesan cheese. Oh yeah, the real stuff, Parmigiano Reggiano. And that's it. Once that's been parmed, it's ready to transfer back into our 500-degree oven for another 15 minutes or so, or until the bottom and edges of our pizza are beautifully browned. And it hopefully looks like this. Oh yeah, that looks good, and way, way too hot to eat. So I think we should transfer that onto a cooling rack and let it sit for at least 10 or 15 minutes before we try to cut it. And by cut it, of course I mean scissor it. Oh yeah, no pizza cutters for a Roman-style pizza. You gotta use scissors. That is just what's done. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut out this corner piece, and then turn this around for the big reveal. And as you can see, thanks to that high hydration, and that long, slow cold ferment, we've achieved a beautifully open crumb, which means lots of big bubbles, and that produces an incredibly light, super airy texture, which is really what makes Roman-style pizza so special. Right, the contrast between that feather-light inside and those crispy edges and bottom crust are just an irresistible combination. And hopefully by the time you're done with those 2 bakings, the bottom of your crust is going to be nicely browned. But if it's not, you know the trick. Just put the pan directly over the burner of your stove and just sort of move it all around till the bottom toasts. And I think that's a great trick to get a little more crunch on the bottom crust if you need to. But anyway, that's it. My sort of simplified, a little bit streamlined take on Roman-style pizza. If you're in the mood for a little break from the thin crust, this is absolutely the way to go. And I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.